What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're doing another rules deep dive video. Today we're going to be talking about reserves in Warhammer 40k. Now, this covers a broad spectrum of unit abilities and ends up being incredibly powerful in 10th edition. In fact, probably one of the most important mechanics for you to master in order to win your games. So let's dive in. Remember to click like on the video, subscribe to the channel, all that YouTube stuff you hear me talk about every single video because it really helps. And I appreciate you when you do it. And let's get into this topic. So first off, what exactly is a reserve? And what is the difference between a reserve and a reinforcement? Now, 40k is a little bit confusing. I can just leave that there, but in this case, we're talking about specifically the fact that the rules like to refer to reinforcements a lot, but reinforcements doesn't really actually mean anything. The actual game term is reserves. Reserves are units that begin the game off the battlefield, and you're not in a transport. Unless that transport itself is in reserve, then everything inside it also counts as being reserved. Now, reserves are broken up into two subcategories, and it's important to note that these are slightly different, those being strategic reserves and all other kinds of reserves. Now, strategic reserves are a special type of reserve that's available to every unit in 40k. You don't have to have a special ability in order to access strategic reserves. You don't have to pay anything to put units into strategic reserves. Anyone in the game can do it, with some restrictions, which we'll talk about later. Now, strategic reserves are reserves, but not all reserves are strategic reserves. Bear with me here, I know this is a little bit confusing. There are other abilities in Warhammer 40,000, such as Deep Strike, which is the most common, that allow units to start the game off the table. Any units that begin the game off the table in this way, whether they're using Deep Strike or another ability, are referred to as reserves, but aren't governed by the same restrictions that apply to strategic reserves, although there is some overlap. Now, that said, there are also some other units that will use these mechanics. For example, replacement units are units that have been destroyed during the game and then are added back into the army and placed back on the table. These are generally affected by a lot of the restrictions that also affect reserve units, specifically things that prevent you from being able to set up on the table. In addition, there are units that begin the game on the table and then can move around the table using the reserves rule. These are called repositioned units, and we'll talk about them in a later section. So when discussing the difference between strategic reserves and standard reserves, the big thing to keep in mind is that strategic reserves are essentially units that are getting onto the table by conventional means. They are outflanking their opponent. They're walking onto the table, or they're parachuting or being deployed elsewhere and then arriving.
Nah, for real, this kind of sucks though.
These will typically come off of a table edge, whereas units in other types of reserve, especially Deep Strike, come on through some more esoteric method, like popping out of the warp, teleporting,
surprise, motherfucker,
being grav shooted in. Those units are much less constrained with how they can arrive on the table, and which we'll talk about momentarily. Now, last week we talked about transports, and talked about the fact that units inside transports enter some sort of meaningless void where they can't be affected by anything and they can't do anything. And that is not the case for units in reserve. Units that are in reserve can still use abilities, provided that those abilities don't require them to be on the battlefield. You'll note that a lot of abilities say when this model or when this unit is on the battlefield, they can do a certain thing. While they're in reserves, they're clearly not on the battlefield. That's kind of the definition, so they can't use those abilities. They can also be targeted by stratagems, again, assuming that those stratagems don't require them to be on the battlefield. There are some stratagems, and one of them in particular that we'll talk about later, that's very important for being able to target units in strategic reserve with. There are also some stratagems that affect them in their command phase, so you can buff them before they arrive on the battlefield, and then they'll come in and they'll be buffed by that stratagem when they arrive. So now let's talk about when you place units into reserve. This happens during the battle formation step. In a lot of the recent rules breakdown videos I've been talking about, we've delved pretty deeply into the battle formation step because it is incredibly incredibly important. Now, this is a step that occurs during the pre-game process before the battle actually begins. It happens after you determine attacker and defender and select the side of the table that you're going to start on. During the battle formation step, it is split into several subsections. The first is attaching leaders into units, then placing units into transports, then placing any units into reserves. And this includes both strategic reserves and other reserves such as deep strike. It's important to note that because this happens after all of these other steps of the battle formation step, you already know where your characters are attached and who's in what transport before you elect to put those units into reserve. Now, there are a couple restrictions on how many things can go into reserve, and it's important to note that you can't put your entire army into strategic reserve to prevent yourself from being shot at, but then lose to a unit of Kroot carnivores.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
First off, your total reserves pool, meaning units in strategic reserve and units in deep strike in the battle formation step, cannot be more than 50% of the total value of your army and the number of units in your army. So, for example, if you had a 2,000 point army, you cannot put more than 50% of that army into reserve, so not more than 1,000 points. If you had 11 units in your army, you could only place 5 of them in total into reserve. And it's important to note that this is calculated after characters are attached to units, and because characters in units are considered to be a single unit, that actually changes the number of units in your army that can then go into reserve. In addition, no more than 25% of the value of your army can be placed into strategic reserve. Now, this isn't in addition to the 50% in total reserves. This is an extra restriction on strategic reserves. So let's say you're playing a 2,000 point game. 1,000 points of your army can be placed into reserve, be it strategic reserve or deep strike. Of that 1,000 points, only 500 can be placed into strategic reserve. That said, there aren't any restrictions on the number of units that can be placed into strategic reserve, only the value of those units. So if your units going into strategic reserve are all super cheap, you can put a bunch of them in there as long as the total number of units in reserve doesn't exceed 50%. Now, as we've discussed in the transports video, units inside transports that are placed into reserve are also considered to be placed into reserve for the purposes of these restrictions as well. So they are also going to be counted towards the number of units in your army that are in reserve and the value of those units. There are some other transport idiosyncrasies with reserves. I talked about that in that video, so please go watch that one if you want more details. Transports are pretty complicated. Turns out everything is. That's why we're doing these videos. So we've talked about what reserves are, how to place units into reserve. Let's talk about getting them out of there and onto the battlefield. Reserves arrive in the reinforcement step of your movement phase. This is why this nomenclature is confusing. Reserves come in the reinforcement step, but aren't reinforcements, they're only reserves. I don't know why they decided to do that and didn't call it the reserve step. It is what it is. We just play the game we've got. This step occurs at the end of your movement phase after all of your other movements have been completed. This means that the unit coming onto the table cannot be selected to activate or move farther in that phase, and they in fact count as having made a normal move already. This means that they won't get the benefits for remaining stationary, for example. However, according to the World Championships of Warhammer FAQ, those units don't actually count as having completed a move, just having made one nebulously in the past. That's a little bit confusing, but it means if you have things like reactive moves that I have a whole video on, those will not trigger in response to a reserve unit coming in next to you. I'm going to assume that we're using that FAQ for the remainder of this video because it does come directly from the Games Workshop events team for use in their most competitive event of the year. Also, according to the World Championships FAQ, transports that arrive during this step cannot disembark units. That only occurs during the normal movement step of the phase. In addition, the Leviathan Tournament packet introduces some additional restrictions on reserves arriving to the battlefield. First off, any reserves cannot arrive in the first battle round. Now, there are some ways to get around this that we'll talk about later on in the video, and you'll also find that some units have abilities that allow you to treat it as a future battle round or arrive during your first movement phase, regardless of any other restrictions like mission rules. A good example of this is drop pods. On top of that, you can't leave units in reserve for the entirety of the game. Units that don't arrive by the end of Battle Round 3 are considered destroyed. Now, there are some ways around this as well, and we'll talk about those when we get to it. Now, let's talk about exactly how units arrive on the table mechanically, and I've jumped into TTS here to explain how this works, because TTS has a lot of really useful tools for visualizing how this happens. First, let's talk about strategic reserves. Units that arrive from strategic reserve cannot do so within 9 inches of enemies. Now, this 9-inch measurement is common to most types of reserves, and it does work a little bit differently than normal measurement. Now, normally when you measure between models, you measure the actual distance between their bases. And for models that are on 3-dimensional terrain, this means that you would measure diagonally. However, for reinforcement setup, and this is the case for both strategic reserves and deep strike and all other kinds of reinforcement arrival, the measurement is only taken horizontally, which means that you're always measuring the true distance along the battlefield itself, the 2-dimensional plane of the battlefield, rather than the 3-dimensional distance between the bases. This is because in some situations you can actually get a little bit closer by being up on top of terrain or measuring to a hull that's slightly off of the ground or something like that. And then it creates weirdness with vertical engagement range that has been a problem for multiple editions in the past, but isn't something that you have to think about right now. Now, assuming that we don't have to deal with any bizarre 3-dimensional terrain, which does throw a lot of wrenches into 40K's rules, unfortunately. All we just have to do is measure between the 2 units and make sure that the unit setting up outside strategic reserve is 9 inches away from every single enemy unit on the table. On top of that, you also set up wholly within 6 inches of a battlefield edge. Now, one of the reasons that we're on TTS here is because TTS actually has this super useful tool that allows you to visualize 6 inches away from the battlefield edge. So basically, when you set up from reserve, you choose one of these table edges, create this huge 6-inch wide band from that, and your unit has to be wholly within that band and 9 inches away from enemies. Now, that's pretty simple. However, there are some additional restrictions, assuming that it is the second battle round. On Battle Round 2, strategic reserves are not allowed to place into the opponent's deployment zone. So assuming that this is the Tyranid deployment zone right here, we can see that if we chose to come off of this table edge, you would come out within this 6-inch band right here, and you could potentially place bank here because there's no enemies preventing you from arriving. That's usually called screening. We call those screening units when they're using their 9-inch denial area to prevent units from coming in near them. However, on the second battle round, they cannot set up within the enemy deployment zone. So the only legal position for them, if they wanted to come off this table, would be somewhere over here. Now, on Battle Round 3, that restriction is alleviated, which means that if they choose to wait a turn and not arrive during the reinforcement step of your second movement phase, they can come in during the third movement phase, which means that they get a more powerful version of strategic reserve. Now, I will point out here that this is one of the special restrictions to strategic reserves, and other types of reserves like deep strikes don't have this restriction. Other types of reserves can come into the opponent's deployment zone on Battle Round 2. It's only strategic reserves that are restricted in this way. It should be noted that there are a lot of abilities. For example, the Stormlance Space Marine detachment has an enhancement that allows its user to treat the battle round as one earlier when arriving from strategic reserves, which means in your first movement phase, they would treat it as Battle Round 2, meaning that they're able to set up in this area outside of your opponent's deployment zone. But because if they hold to the second battle round, it treats them as being in the third battle round, they would actually be able to set up in your opponent's deployment zone. So that is one thing to keep in mind as well. That's pretty non-standard, though. It requires a very specific style of mechanic, which a lot of armies have access to, but is relatively rare. Now let's talk about units in Deep Strike. Deep Strike is an ability that is in the core rules of the game and allows you to start the game in reserve, but isn't a strategic reserve. It's basically its own type of reserve. They count towards your normal cap of 50% and half the units in your army, but they don't count towards your 25% in strategic reserves. Deep striking units usually are flying onto the table or are teleporting and can come in regardless of where the battlefield edges are. The only restriction to deep striking units is that they have to be at least 9 or more inches away from any enemies. If they meet that requirement, they're good to go. There are no other restrictions on deep striking models, which means they can come into your deployment zone, they can come in behind terrain, basically wherever they want to go. Very similar to Strategic Reserve, but a much more powerful version. Now, just like Strategic Reserve, they can't come in on the first battle round unless they have a special ability, but they don't have any differences between coming in Battle Round 2 or Battle Round 3. Now, one additional idiosyncrasy is that units that are in Strategic Reserve that have the Deep Strike ability can arrive to the battlefield using the Deep Strike rules. While most of the time a unit with the Deep Strike ability will just enter Deep Strike instead of Strategic Reserves when the game begins, there are many abilities that allow you to enter Strategic Reserve during the game, and having Deep Strike on units with that style of ability is very powerful because it then allows you to come in anywhere on the table rather than 6 inches off of a table edge. And that's in fact a pretty good segue, because that's the style of ability we're going to be talking about right now. Now, these mechanics are called repositions. The community has also dubbed them some other terms. Some people call them flickers, which is kind of similar to like a Magic the Gathering thing where a unit is removed from the battlefield and then enters the battlefield again. My favorite is uppy downies. That one sounds fun, so that's the one that I use. But these are specifically units that begin the game on the table and then are placed into reserve or are removed from the battlefield later to be set up again. Now, these aren't actually reserves, but the reason that we're talking about them in this video is because they are subject to all of the same rules and restrictions that reserves are. The reason it's important is that they're not reserves is that in some instances they can arrive during the first battle round, whereas normal reserves can't do that. They also don't count against your restrictions. So even if half of your army is in reserve at the beginning of the game during the battle formation step, you can then use reposition effects on your units that actually begin the game on the table. Generally speaking, these will come into play during a command phase, at the end of a turn, or at the end of a fight phase. They place the unit into the reinforcements area and then will usually specify a time for them to return. Now, some of them put the unit into strategic reserve, meaning that they then arrive as a reserve using all the strategic reserve rules that we talked about previously. Now, anytime that they are removed, it's important to note that they retain their current strength and any damage on the units, as well as the status of any persistent effects on them. Also, interestingly, according to the rules commentary, if they are off the table during your battle shock step, but the unit is currently below half strength, once they're placed on the table, they'll take a battle shock check. While they're in reserve, they actually don't have to take battle shock checks while they're off the table, but when they come back on, they'll have to take one. That's a pretty interesting one that doesn't come up very often, but it's one to keep in mind in case it comes up in your games. Now, there are some restrictions and abilities available to units that are repositioning, and a lot of these are governed by the World Championships of Warhammer FAQ. Units can use reposition abilities in the first battle round under some circumstances. For example, if the ability removes them from the battlefield but doesn't specify that they're in strategic reserves, or if they're in strategic reserves but have the deep strike ability. I don't know entirely about that one. I think it's because like the deep strike rule overrides the strategic reserve rule that stops them from coming in first battle round. I don't know. So basically, if you have an ability that says at the end of your opponent's turn, for example, you can be removed from the battlefield and set back up in your reinforcement step, and your opponent goes first, at the end of their turn, you can remove those units from the table and then set them back up in your first movement phase. This is one of the ways that you can get units to reserve onto the table in the first battle round. If the unit that you're using this ability on, for example, Space Marine Scouts, says that the unit goes into strategic reserve specifically, then they cannot arrive back on the first battle round. If your opponent goes first and you use that ability to remove them from the table, they will skip your first movement phase and then arrive back on in your second movement phase. However, if they have the deep strike ability, and there are some ways to do this, for example, you can do it by giving a unit of scouts deep strike with Uriel Ventress in Ultramarines, then that unit will be placed into strategic reserve, deep strike will override their normal reserves, then they can be placed into strategic reserves during your opponent's turn, and then in your first reinforcement step, deep strike onto the table. Now let's talk about a particular type of unit that has some unique interactions with strategic reserves, that being aircraft. Now, aircraft are a little weird. They automatically start in reserve, and this is assuming that you have the aircraft keyword and you haven't chosen to use the hover ability to remove the keyword from yourself. All of the aircraft rules only work if you haven't turned on your hover jets. So like I said, aircraft must start in reserve, but they automatically are placed into their own style of reserve. This is one of the few ways that units can get into reserve but not use strategic reserve or deep strike. That means that they count against your 50% of the army in reserve and the half of your army that is allowed to start in reserve. After the game begins, so after the declare battle formation step has concluded, they move from being a regular reserve to being a strategic reserve. The reason that that is relevant is that aircraft count against the 50% limits on the number of reserves in your army, but do not count against the 25% limit of the number of units that you can have in strategic reserves. This allows you to have lots of aircraft in your army without any of them being destroyed by having to start in reserve, but you not having enough open space for them. So let's say we have our beautiful blue Storm Raven gunship here, and we have elected not to turn on its hover jet, so it's acting as a normal aircraft for the remainder of the game. This Storm Raven gunship is then placed into reserves during battle formations, and once the game begins, then moves to strategic reserves. That means that on the second or third battle rounds, it can arrive on the table wholly within 6 inches of a battlefield edge of your choice. On the second battle round, it must be outside your opponent's deployment zone, and in all times, it must be 9 inches away from your opponent's models. Now, one thing that's important to note is that aircraft always use their base when measuring, assuming that they have one, which means that whenever we're setting up units on the edge of the table like this, we don't have to worry about parts of the model that are protruding over the edge. That allows most aircraft to pretty easily fit wholly within 6 inches of the table edge here. However, some units are a little bit too large. We'll discuss what happens when a unit that is physically too large to fit into this area deploys out of reserve momentarily. But for right now, we're talking about aircraft. Now, once on the battlefield, aircraft have a pretty unique ability. Anytime an aircraft moves, if it wants to, it can move off of the battlefield. If it does so, and it ends that movement with any part of its base touching that battlefield edge, then it immediately enters strategic reserve. So these guys basically have their own baked-in reposition effect that only allows them to enter strategic reserve by flying off the battlefield. It should be noted, however, that if the aircraft decides to do this, it is required to return to the battlefield in your next movement phase. It can't stay off the battlefield like other reposition effects might be able to. Reposition effects like this are not subject to that battle round 3 limit. So if an aircraft flies off the table at the end of battle round 3, for example, and then battle round 3 ends and reserves units would be destroyed, it doesn't count and it's able to come in battle round 4. So we've talked about aircraft, but I mentioned that some weird things happen if you are a particularly large model and are arriving from strategic reserve. Now, when a unit arrives from strategic reserve, but is physically too large to set up wholly within 6 inches of a battlefield edge, so for example, we've elected to strategic reserve this Imperial Guard Baneblade here. And as we can see, the Baneblade with its big sponsons, and especially because it hull measures, is not allowed to extend over the battlefield, so it is much too large to fit wholly within this 6-inch band that a strategic reserver would normally have to jump into. If that is the case, then that model must set up touching your battlefield edge. So assuming that we're the blue player in this case and we have the blue deployment zone, you look on the deployment card that you've drawn for the game, and that will tell you which of the table edges is your battlefield edge. It's typically the one that has the majority of your deployment zone on it. You'll choose any point on that table edge, and you'll set up this large unit in base contact with that point of the table. So for example, we could do this. So for example, we could do like this, and it is touching that point of the edge. Now, from that point onwards, we don't care about how far it is up the table. We don't care about being wholly within 6 inches of the table edge. Now, obviously, the restriction is that units that are strategic reserving like this must set up off your battlefield edge, and they have some restrictions on what they can do the turn that they arrive. They cannot make a normal move, advance, or fall back, remain stationary, which means their heavy weapons turn off, make any ranged weapons, or declare a charge. This does mean that in some instances they're able to fight in combat. For example, if somebody piles into them, they can potentially fight and pile in and consolidate, but they can't make any voluntary style actions. Now, there is a way to get around this that's a little bit sneaky by using the rapid ingress stratagem, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So now let's talk about probably the most important part of reserving in 10th edition, and one of the most powerful abilities available to armies that are using reserves, and to honestly any unit that's inside reserve. And in my opinion, one of the coolest introductions in 10th edition. This is a core stratagem, which means it's available to every army and every detachment in the game and costs you 1 CP. It's used at the end of your opponent's movement phase, meaning at the end of their reinforcement step. So all of their moves have been completed and all of their reinforcements have been set up. So you have perfect knowledge, unless your opponent has the ability to move in other phases, of where their units are going to be setting up. When you use this stratagem, you target one of your units that is in reserves, whether that be strategic reserves or deep strike or even a repositioning unit. That unit can then arrive as if it were your movement phase. Now this allows you to do a ton. Now this opens up a ton of possibilities. As we talked about in the previous section, if you do this with a large model, that model comes in off of your table edge, and if it's strategic reserving and couldn't normally do stuff, it's prevented from doing things for the remainder of your opponent's turn. Then it goes to your turn, and they are free to do things. In addition, if you have a unit, especially melee units that are short range and want to get up close and personal to your opponent, you can use them to deep strike or a strategic reserve 9 inches away from enemies, then eligible to move in your movement phase, whereas units arriving from reserve normally are not. You can also use this to restrict enemy movement, block charges, take unoccupied objectives, or just occupy real estate that your opponent's not using. Unlike reserving, units coming in from Rapid Ingress are present on the table during your command phase, meaning that they are much less restricted in what they can do compared to normal reserves that are coming in at the standard time. Now, obviously, the downside is that it costs you a command point, but that's usually a small price to pay for the amount of flexibility that you get from a unit arriving from Rapid Ingress. Now, there's some interesting things you can do with this. First off, if you have an ability that we talked about previously that it considers the battle round as earlier than it is normally when a unit is setting up, you can potentially use this to Rapid Ingress a turn earlier. Now, it's important to note that this only works for some abilities of this style. Because it's occurring in your opponent's movement phase and not your movement phase, there are some abilities that, for example, allow you to bring reinforcements in on your first movement phase, and it is not your first movement phase, it's your opponent's movement phase, and out of phase rules don't apply. On top of that, you can also use it to arrive at the end of the third battle round. If you don't bring them in by the end of the battle round, they're destroyed, but if you are going first, your opponent will have a turn, which allows you to then pay a CP to Rapid Ingress to bring them in after all your opponent's reserves have arrived. And it's a big benefit to going first with units that are staying in Deep Strike or Strategic Reserves. Now, other than that, all of the normal restrictions apply to units arriving via Rapid Ingress. And on top of that, Rapid Ingress cannot be used to bring a unit in on a battle round that it isn't normally allowed to arrive. This means that you can't use it to bring normal strategic reserves in on the first battle round unless you have one of the special abilities we talked about previously. And obviously, you can't use it to bring in normal reserves on battle round 4 because those would have been destroyed at that point. This stratagem is ludicrously powerful, and once you see it in action in the hands of a good player, it is extremely strong, and one of the biggest benefits that reserve units have in 10th edition. Now, last but certainly not least, we're back in TTS for one more section, and that's to talk about units that change the normal distances that you would normally be able to set up near enemies. Now, the first style of ability like this is something like Inceptors. Space Marine Inceptors have an ability that allow them to, when they're deep striking, set up outside 3 inches of enemies rather than the normal 9. Now, this is measured horizontally, just like the 9 inches that you would measure for normal reserves, but obviously is much closer, and this lets you jump onto objectives or get range to units that thought they would be hiding, or potentially even Rapid Ingress to block charges or to get in your opponent's way. Now, that said, there are some other units, for example, Space Marine Infiltrators, that have the opposite ability, abilities that prevent enemies from arriving close to them. A good example here are these Primaris Infiltrators that prevent you from setting up within 12 inches of them rather than the normal 9, again, measured horizontally as normal. Now, the increase in denial radius of a unit like this is much greater than the standard 9 inches that you would get from any normal unit. However, they also have an additional hidden benefit, and that's the fact that according to the sequencing rules in the rules commentary, any abilities like Omni Scramblers that prevent units from setting up automatically override abilities that allow units to arrive closer. This means that while Inceptors would normally be able to set up 3 inches outside of enemy units, the Infiltrators in fact force them back to set up outside 12 inches, which makes units like these Infiltrators that have these denial abilities incredibly good at preventing units like Inceptors from arriving to the table, and they're an incredible tool when protecting yourself against enemy deep strikers and reserves. And with that, those are all of the reserve rules in Warhammer 40k. There's a lot of idiosyncrasies and nuance to these abilities, so I hope that this video was eye-opening to you, and if it was, let me know down in the comment section. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers also help out a huge deal, and I really appreciate them too. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming. Do you mind? Oh, you want to snuggle? No, you just want to jump on the ground. I don't understand you, kitty cat.